Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Vienna, 2011. Renovation workers expected dust, not dread. When drills struck through concrete beneath a popular neighborhood ice cream shop, the air shifted instantly. It wasn't just debris in the cellar air. It was a smell no one could mistake. Within minutes, authorities arrived and realized this wasn't a routine construction find. It was the beginning of a crime story buried for years. The call came from ordinary contractors, men hired to update plumbing lines beneath a well-known shop. They had no connection to law enforcement, no reason to assume they were about to trigger one of Austria's most infamous homicide investigations. They described to dispatchers a smell like rot, rising as the jackhammers cracked open newer layers of concrete beneath the shop floor. Police cars rolled up almost immediately, lights flashing on a street that rarely saw emergency response. The first responders didn't storm in with dramatic shouts. They moved with discipline. The shop was locked down within minutes. Every worker was asked to step aside. Tools were tagged as potential secondary evidence, and officers began noting quiet anomalies. Flooring inconsistent with the building's renovation history, patchwork in places not tied to official permits, a cellar space that looked newer than the business records indicated. Even before forensic teams entered, supervisors marked the site as a crime scene under suspicion. That classification came not from wild speculation, but from accumulated anomalies: the odor, the layered concrete, and the inconsistent floor plan. Law enforcement had no room for guesswork. They treated it as evidence until proven otherwise. By the early evening, excavation was halted. The focus turned to containment. Police documented the area in high-resolution stills, mapped out the cellar grid, and restricted the location. The shop's public image, a place known for summer treats and community gatherings, now stood behind taped perimeters. Local residents watched in disbelief, whispering that something catastrophic must have been found. And inside the cellar, specialists began identifying remains that would later be confirmed as belonging to two missing men: Holger Holtz, who had disappeared in 2008, and Manfred Hinterberger, last seen in 2010. At this stage, police did not release names. To the public, it was only possible human remains. But within police files, the missing persons list in Vienna suddenly took on chilling relevance. Authorities moved fast. Forensic recovery teams documented the removal in sequence. Each fragment was bagged, numbered, and logged, maintaining chain of custody to the letter. There was no repeat digging after discovery, only controlled extraction. Investigators were careful not to contaminate the cellar floor or suggest anything beyond what they could prove. From the start, this wasn't a body found in a field kind of case. This was remains hidden under the floor of a business still operating in the heart of a European capital. That factor alone guaranteed intense scrutiny. Reporters crowded the street that evening. Police remained silent, issuing only a single line to local press: "We have located human remains, and the case is under active investigation." By nightfall, the remains were secured, the cellar sealed, and all workers interviewed. Police would not say more, but in investigative culture, the unspoken was clear. When remains are found in a confined space like this, the case is not just about identity. It is about intent, concealment, and access. Someone had the means to kill, dismember, and entomb two adults under the floor without detection for years. That night, forensic vans carried evidence out of the shop toward the city morgue. The community didn't yet know whose lives had ended in that cellar. Families of the missing, though, would soon get calls asking them to submit DNA samples. Two names from Vienna's missing person files were about to shift from "where are they" to "here they are." The remains recovered from beneath the Vienna ice cream shop were not left on site. Within hours of discovery, forensic vans transferred them directly to the city morgue. Investigators knew the shop was just one layer of the case. The real answers would be found in the controlled environment of the autopsy suite. Inside the morgue, protocol was rigid. Each package containing human material was sealed, labeled, and logged by time and officer signature. Chain of custody had to be airtight. In high-profile homicide investigations, especially those with years separating the deaths, every misstep could compromise admissibility. The teams approached with quiet precision, cameras recording every step, each item cataloged into evidence management systems. When pathologists began their examination, it was clear this wasn't a single victim case. Distinct decomposition stages pointed to at least two individuals, killed at different times. One set of remains showed advanced skeletal reduction, suggesting a burial period of nearly 3 years. Another carried more recent decomposition consistent with less than 12 months underground. These timelines aligned closely with two unresolved missing person files. Holger Holtz, last seen in 2008, and Manfred Hinterberger, reported absent in 2010. Dental records were the first step. Austrian authorities retrieved prior dental charts from both men's family dentists. The comparison was clinical. Tooth morphology, fillings, and root structure provided matches. DNA confirmation followed, cross-checked against relatives. Forensic science converted what had been community rumor into hard fact. The missing were no longer just unaccounted for. They were identified. The manner of death was no less disturbing. Both sets of remains bore evidence of firearm trauma. Entry points to cranial bone fragments suggested shots delivered at close range. In one victim, the round trajectory was downward, consistent with an execution-style shot. The second carried multiple fractures showing similar ballistic signatures. Pathologists concluded both men had been killed with a firearm, then subjected to post-mortem dismemberment. Tool mark analysis added another layer. Sections of bone displayed uniform cut patterns, matching the mechanical rhythm of a chainsaw blade. Preliminary analysis confirmed the use of a motorized cutting tool. These marks were not exploratory or hesitant. They were systematic, intended to reduce body mass for concealment. Beyond cause of death and dismemberment, pathologists examined trace materials trapped within concrete residue attached to the remains. Samples revealed fine cement particles consistent with quickset mixtures commercially available during 2008 and 2010. Investigators compared these with purchase records pulled later from local suppliers. It was not speculation. It was a timeline hidden in building material. The morgue scene was not just science, it was also silence. The room was cold, sterile, but every step carried weight. Technicians spoke minimally, their words functional. Bag sealed, sample taken, photograph complete. These were not dramatics. They were the language of procedure, the way justice is built, one recorded detail at a time. By the end of the autopsies, the investigative team had a framework. Victims confirmed: Holger Holtz, 2008 disappearance; Manfred Hinterberger, 2010 disappearance. Cause of death: firearm trauma, homicide. Post-mortem action: dismemberment with chainsaw, concealment in concrete. Time intervals matched to years each man vanished. For law enforcement, this was enough to shift the case classification from suspicious death to confirmed double homicide. These men did not vanish of their own accord. They were murdered, their bodies concealed deliberately in the very business they were tied to. It is here that an important question arises, one that any true crime viewer has likely asked in similar cases. How does someone commit not one but two homicides and keep those secrets buried in the floor of a public shop for years? What conditions allow that to happen without detection? The autopsy stage didn't provide motive. It didn't reveal who pulled the trigger or poured the concrete, but it did lock down the irrefutable. Two men, murdered and hidden, in a location accessible only to someone with consistent control over that property. The pathologists handed their reports back to investigators. For the first time in years, families received definitive news. Missing was no longer a status. It was homicide. This case would not be solved by rumor or by assumption. It would be solved by layering forensic discoveries: phone logs, bank records, witness testimony, and psychological assessments, each stacked against the framework the morgue had now provided. By the close of this phase, detectives had a dual homicide file on their desks. They had the names of the victims, they had the mechanism of death, they had the concealment method, and they had a timeline that pointed toward the years the men had last been seen alive. What they did not yet have was the clear thread tying all of it to one accountable individual. The next phase of the investigation would move outside the morgue, beyond bone and bullet. It would follow digital traces and financial patterns, because in modern homicide cases, bodies are not the only evidence. Data can tell a story too. The morgue had given investigators certainty: two men, murdered years apart, both hidden in the same location. But autopsy files don't explain how victims lived their final days or why they suddenly went silent. For that, detectives turned to digital evidence and financial records, because when people vanish, their phones and bank accounts usually stop before their bodies are found. Police analysts pulled call data from Austrian telecom providers. For Holger Holtz, the trail cut off abruptly in 2008. His last outgoing call was to a business associate regarding equipment for the ice cream shop. There were no goodbyes, no farewells to friends or family. Within hours, his phone activity ended completely. He didn't attempt to port his number, didn't open a new account elsewhere. Investigators marked this as negative evidence, no phone activity, after the summer of 2008. For Manfred Hinterberger, the pattern was eerily similar. In 2010, his digital presence collapsed almost overnight. And he exchanged texts with a family member about routine plans, but after that week, nothing. No further texts, no incoming calls answered, no data usage. Analysts confirmed there was no migration of his SIM card, no replacement handset activated in his name. The absence of activity wasn't negligence, it was termination. Financial records told a parallel story. Holtz had maintained joint accounts tied to the shop's revenue streams. Those accounts showed withdrawals consistent with business operations until mid-2008, then froze. No further deposits, no card usage, no attempts to close or transfer funds. His personal account reflected the same. An abrupt end, no international transactions, no hidden savings withdrawals. Hinterberger's finances mirrored that silence. He had routine payments, rent, utilities, groceries, until 2010. Then, without warning, all activity stopped. His bank flagged the inactivity as unusual, but because no fraud was suspected at the time, no alarm was raised. Only later, when his remains were recovered, did that gap lock into place as evidence. Investigators didn't just note what was missing. They looked for what continued. The shop itself remained open. Utilities were paid. Supplies came in. Equipment was serviced. Someone was keeping the business alive, even as both men disappeared from every traceable ledger. That continuity mattered. It suggested that while victims' lives had ended, their environment was maintained. Detectives cross-referenced travel records. Neither Holtz nor Hinterberger showed exit stamps on passports. No airline tickets were purchased under their identities. Immigration databases confirmed neither man left Austria in the years after their last appearances. That finding cut off the theory of voluntary disappearance. Investigators then examined correspondence. Emails recovered from both men's accounts painted a portrait of strain. Holtz had written drafts to legal advisors about disputes over assets tied to his marriage and business. Hinterberger had emails referencing tension about debts and obligations within the same shop. Neither man had written of plans to abandon his life. In fact, both expressed intent to remain connected to Vienna and to their families. For detectives, the alignment was too precise. Holtz disappears in 2008, Hinterberger in 2010. Both linked to the same business, both drop off the digital map in almost identical patterns. No phone calls, no financial activity, no cross-border travel. The data aligned too cleanly, one investigator remarked later. Sometimes that was the problem. Disappearances rarely fit this perfect a template without intervention. This phase of the investigation shifted the case from bones and bullets to the everyday trails people leave behind. Forensic accountants worked alongside homicide detectives charting bank timelines next to cell phone records. When overlaid, the charts formed two steep cliffs, steady normal activity, then a sudden and permanent fall. Those cliffs matched the forensic dating of death from the morgue. By assembling this mosaic of silence, investigators confirmed what pathologists had already suggested. Both men were killed at the time their lives abruptly vanished from record. What remained open was the question of access. Who had control over the shop, the finances, and the ability to manage appearances while two men were removed from the picture? In towns and cities alike, crimes are often uncovered by inconsistencies. Here it was consistency that raised alarms. Two men, 2 years apart, their exits stamped in the same clean pattern. The probability of coincidence was minimal, as the probability of design was overwhelming. As detectives built their timeline, families of the victims were briefed on findings. Holtz's relatives confirmed he would never abandon contact. Hinterberger's family said the same. Their statements reinforced digital proof. These were not voluntary departures. They were forced removals. Instead of dropping into a checklist, the investigators wove the findings together. Both Holtz and Hinterberger had been cut off in the same way. Their phones went silent without warning. Their bank cards stopped swiping. Their emails froze mid-conversation. Nothing suggested relocation, no passport stamps or airline records to show a new life elsewhere. And in their private correspondence, the opposite appeared. Plans for the future, debts to settle, business still in motion. That silence wasn't absence, it was evidence. It told detectives the men hadn't chosen to disappear. Their lives had been cut short, and their daily records ended with them. And for investigators, the pattern was too precise to be coincidence. Two men, linked to the same business, falling off the grid in almost identical ways. This was design. With those conclusions locked in, the file shifted direction. The next task wasn't just about numbers or phone logs, it was about the men themselves, who they were, what relationships shaped their lives, and how those tensions may have escalated into lethal risk. To understand the crime, detectives had to build full victim profiles, and that's where the story turns next. The silence in digital records only raised more questions. To move forward, detectives turned to the men themselves, who they were, how they lived, and what personal dynamics might have brought them into fatal risk. Holger Holtz was first. By all accounts, he was steady, meticulous, a man who preferred routines. Colleagues recalled how he tracked his expenses to the cent, how he kept every receipt in folders, even how he was cautious with friendships. His disappearance in 2008 puzzled everyone who knew him. There was no indication he would abandon his responsibilities. He had a marriage that, on the surface, gave him stability. Yet investigators learned that arguments had mounted behind closed doors, disagreements over finances, and tension around their joint business. Those conflicts painted a picture of strain, but nothing that alone explained a sudden vanishing act. 2 years later, in 2010, another man, Manfred Hinterberger, was gone. His profile contrasted sharply. More outgoing, more impulsive, he was drawn to risks and known to speak his mind. Friends remembered him as ambitious, eager to expand the ice cream business that had become central to his life. Unlike Holtz, Hinterberger lived more loosely, but he too left behind unfinished obligations, loans, appointments, and personal ties that no one believed he would simply walk away from. The abrupt halt in his routines paralleled Holtz's disappearance far too neatly. Detectives began to map the overlap. Both men had been romantically linked to the same woman. Both were tied into the same ice cream shop in Vienna that served as their shared business interest. And both ended their communication, banking, and physical presence in a way that suggested not voluntary absence but an imposed silence. The risk assessment escalated immediately. The chance that two men, years apart, both connected to the same personal and business circle, would disappear with the same abrupt finality was astronomically low. Investigators widened interviews. Friends and family members described patterns of conflict, one man growing withdrawn, the other increasingly frustrated with mounting disputes. Financial pressures were highlighted, including disagreements over ownership shares in the business. Witnesses noted rising hostility, subtle threats, and remarks that in hindsight sounded more dangerous than anyone wanted to believe at the time. When asked if either man had enemies, the answers converged. Not in the outside world, but possibly closer to home. The pattern alarmed investigators. These weren't unrelated vanishings. They looked more like stages in a sequence, a timeline of escalating personal disputes that had crossed into deadly territory. But confirming that required more than testimony. It needed forensic grounding, something to anchor the suspicions to physical evidence. One detective later remarked, "We weren't just looking at two missing men anymore. We were looking at two lives cut short in parallel, and the common denominator was too obvious to ignore." By this stage, the investigation no longer treated Holtz and Hinterberger as simple missing persons. Both were reclassified in working files as probable homicide victims. And with that, the procedural gears shifted toward establishing motive and identifying who might gain from erasing them from both personal and business life. This is where victimology served its purpose, not just in painting portraits of the dead, but in exposing the tensions that bridged them. The escalation was visible now, and the investigative spotlight was narrowing, ready to confront the uncomfortable truth of who stood at the center of it all. As victimology made clear the direct links between Holger Holtz and Manfred Hinterberger, investigators faced the next procedural step, moving from suspicions to a structured prosecutorial theory. For detectives, this was no longer just a missing persons inquiry with dark undertones. It was a double homicide staged years apart, but connected by one individual and one place, the Vienna ice cream shop. The challenge was no longer about proving the men were gone, but about building a case strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of court. Prosecutors in Austria required more than circumstantial patterns. They needed a narrative grounded in forensic evidence, supported by digital and financial anomalies, and corroborated by testimony that could establish motive. Forensic technicians had already secured fragments of human remains from beneath the concrete. The morgue confirmed they belonged to Holtz and Hinterberger. That gave prosecutors their foundation: two men, two timelines, both converging under one floor. The chain of custody became critical. Every piece of bone, every trace of tissue was logged and transported with meticulous detail. Defense attorneys would challenge anything less than airtight handling. To prepare, detectives worked in close collaboration with forensic pathologists, ensuring that every sample was accounted for and tied to the shop's subfloor excavation. Laboratory reports showed ballistic evidence consistent with execution-style gunshots. That fact alone shaped the prosecutorial narrative. These were not accidents, not disputes that spiraled out of control. They were deliberate acts. Financial records strengthened the theory. Holtz had ongoing disputes about asset distribution in 2008. Hinterberger, 2 years later, was pressing to expand the business. In both instances, the men's interests clashed with the same partner. Bank accounts revealed sudden withdrawals, uncharacteristic gaps in personal spending, and abrupt silence in financial transactions at the time of disappearance. Investigators saw those details as working evidence of foul play. What prosecutors needed now was motive that jurors could understand. Investigators presented a dual theory: personal betrayal intertwined with financial gain. Both men had intimate ties to the same woman and had financial entanglements in the same small business. That overlap gave the prosecution their bridge. Emotional conflict explained proximity. Financial conflict explained escalation. Strategically, the decision was made to pursue a consolidated homicide indictment rather than treat the two cases separately. Prosecutors feared that if the crimes were charged as unrelated, defense counsel could argue coincidence or misidentification. By linking the murders procedurally, they reinforced the narrative that this was a pattern, one individual eliminating two partners when disputes peaked. Court filings outlined the sequence with clinical precision. Holtz disappeared in 2008, Hinterberger in 2010. Both bodies were recovered in 2011 from the same location. Forensic ballistics confirmed gunshot wounds. No forced entry indicated that both men were killed in a setting of trust, not ambush from outsiders. That narrowed opportunity to the smallest possible circle. Witness statements also supported the timeline. Colleagues reported Holtz expressing concern about his marriage and finances weeks before he vanished. Friends of Hinterberger recalled him saying he felt pressured and controlled in the months leading to his disappearance. Taken individually, these were worrying but not decisive. Combined, they revealed a pattern of conflict escalating toward violence. The charging theory hinged on proving deliberate concealment. Prosecutors highlighted the architectural effort required to bury two bodies beneath reinforced flooring. That action, they argued, required planning, tools, and intent to obstruct discovery for years. It was not impulsive, but premeditated. By late 2011, investigators and prosecutors met to finalize the indictment. Their files carried the names of two victims, their dates of disappearance, and the forensics that connected them to the same location. At the center of every line was one name, one figure who held control over the business and over the men's personal lives. The charging documents reflected that clarity. For law enforcement, this was the turning point. Suspicion had become certainty, and certainty had become formal charges. The Vienna crime had moved from whispers of betrayal to the full weight of the Austrian judicial system. At this stage, detectives understood their role was shifting. Their fieldwork was largely complete. The courtroom would now be the battleground where evidence was tested and narrative was contested. And so the case advanced, ready to confront legal scrutiny and open trial. When the charges were filed, the Austrian courts prepared for one of the most closely followed proceedings Vienna had seen in years. The double homicide of Holger Holtz and Manfred Hinterberger was no longer just an investigation sealed within police reports. It was set to unfold in a courtroom, under the scrutiny of judges, journalists, and a public eager to understand how two men had vanished, only to be discovered entombed beneath the floor of an ice cream parlor. The prosecution approached the trial with a meticulous strategy. They did not need to rely on speculation. They had two separate sets of remains, both recovered in conditions that could be directly linked to the same location. Forensic analysts testified that the decomposition timelines corresponded to the two distinct disappearances, Holtz in 2008, Hinterberger in 2010. Ballistic examinations confirmed that the projectiles recovered were fired from the same small-caliber weapon. That consistency gave weight to the theory of a single offender acting with deliberation, not chance. The chain of custody for evidence was laid out step by step in court. Construction workers had uncovered the remains during renovation. Police secured the site. Forensic teams extracted bone fragments and personal effects, and every handover was documented. This procedural detail mattered because the defense could not argue contamination or mishandling. The record was clean, and the jury knew it. Holtz's disappearance in 2008 had once been explained away as marital discord, a man who walked out and never came back. Hinterberger's absence in 2010 raised similar suspicions, but without bodies or crime scene access at the time, no arrest had been possible. Now, the evidence was undeniable. The prosecutor framed it for the jury. Both men, connected to the same woman, had died by gunshot, both concealed in the same business premises. That pattern was not coincidence, it was intent. The defense attempted to humanize the accused. They presented her as a woman under pressure, describing strained relationships, a collapsing business, and emotional instability. They suggested that if she acted, it had been under provocation, not premeditation. But psychiatric evaluations introduced at trial painted a sharper picture: calculated planning, concealment over years, and a lack of immediate disclosure to authorities. Experts testified that this pattern was not consistent with spontaneous rage, but with organized effort to erase two lives from record. As the days of testimony progressed, the trial became less about whether she had pulled the trigger and more about what should follow. The evidence was too consistent to deny, and the defense gradually shifted toward mitigating factors, emphasizing her mental health. In Austrian law, that distinction mattered. A defendant deemed incapable of full criminal responsibility could face indefinite institutionalization rather than a fixed prison term. Prosecutors argued that society required maximum protection. Defense attorneys countered that treatment, not punishment, was more appropriate. Witnesses gave context that was both mundane and chilling. Former employees described how the ice cream shop always seemed unnaturally cool in certain areas. Friends of the victims recalled sudden disappearances without farewells, leaving personal items behind. Financial records showed interrupted payments and debts that coincided with the time each man was last seen. Piece by piece, the narrative converged. These were not men who chose to vanish. They were silenced. For the jury, and for those listening in court, the case carried a lesson about concealment. Not everything hidden stays buried. The image of human remains stored beneath a business where families once gathered for ice cream left a lasting mark. It was not just a crime. It was a betrayal of community trust, a contamination of ordinary life. By the time final arguments were delivered, the outcome seemed almost inevitable. The prosecution asked for lifelong placement in a secure psychiatric institution. The defense requested leniency, citing diminished capacity. The presiding judge summarized the findings: 2 homicides proven by physical and ballistic evidence, carried out with intent and concealed with extraordinary effort. The verdict was entered: guilty, with confinement in a maximum security psychiatric facility for life. That sentence carried a weight different from a standard prison term. It acknowledged both the severity of the crimes and the assessment that treatment was necessary, but it also ensured she would never return to ordinary society. For the families of Holger Holtz and Manfred Hinterberger, justice was no longer a question of speculation. It was formal, documented, and permanent. The trial closed a chapter that had spanned nearly a decade, from Holtz's disappearance in 2008 to the verdict years later. The ice cream shop no longer stood as a place of casual community visits. It became a landmark in Vienna's criminal history, remembered not for what it sold, but for what it concealed. And for investigators, it reinforced a principle that remains true in every jurisdiction. Patterns matter. Silence is never proof of absence. and buried truths surface eventually. The verdict in Vienna did not end the story. In many ways, it began a different chapter, one that reached beyond the courtroom walls and into the fabric of the community. The revelation that two men, Holger Holtz and Manfred Hinterberger, had been killed years apart and concealed beneath the floor of a neighborhood ice cream shop left a mark that was both practical and psychological. Families had brought their children to that store, sat at tables above what was, in truth, a concealed crime scene. That reality was difficult for the public to reconcile, and it became part of why the trial carried such weight. The Austrian authorities ensured that the ice cream parlor would never reopen under the same circumstances. The building itself stood as a silent witness to what had been hidden for nearly a decade. Local media covered the dismantling of the shop extensively, noting how investigators insisted that every inch of the subfloor be checked to confirm no additional remains existed. The narrative shifted from two missing men to two proven victims, and the community responded with a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. From a procedural standpoint, the case became a study in delayed discovery. For years, the missing persons files for Holtz and Hinterberger had carried minimal updates. Their sudden reappearance in such extraordinary circumstances highlighted gaps in investigative continuity. Detectives who had worked the early years of each disappearance spoke publicly about the frustration of lacking actionable evidence back then. Now, with the forensic chain sealed and verdict secured, law enforcement agencies used the case to underscore the necessity of re-examining long-term disappearances, even when leads appear exhausted. The psychiatric dimension of the sentencing also drew attention. Placement in a secure facility rather than a conventional prison underscored Austria's legal approach to offenders assessed as both dangerous and impaired. Some members of the public questioned whether institutionalization was too lenient for two confirmed killings. Others argued it was the most secure outcome possible, ensuring lifetime containment without parole. What was certain was that the verdict closed off the possibility of her return to ordinary life. That balance between punishment and protection is one societies confront repeatedly when mental health intersects with violent crime. The families of both victims had the chance to make impact statements at the conclusion of trial proceedings. Though concise, their words captured the enduring loss. For Holtz's relatives, the years of uncertainty, never knowing why he had disappeared, added weight to the grief. For Hinterberger's family, the shock of learning his life had ended in such a calculated way left scars that no verdict could erase. In their voices, the public heard the reminder that crime is not only a violation of law, it is a rupture in human connection. Media coverage was relentless during the weeks of the trial. International outlets reported on the bizarre and chilling details, bodies concealed in a business serving the public, years of silence before discovery, and the calculated steps to cover up two homicides. Commentators noted that the case blurred boundaries between domestic conflict, serial offending, and concealment. It did not fit neatly into one category. It was both intimate and methodical, personal and clinical. That complexity was part of why it gripped the public imagination. For investigators, the trial and its aftermath validated years of procedural rigor. Every chain of custody document, every forensic test, every financial record retrieved had mattered. It also highlighted the role of chance. Without construction workers breaking into the floor during renovations, the remains may have stayed hidden indefinitely. In law enforcement circles, the case was cited as an example of why missing persons files must remain open and periodically reviewed. Hidden crimes often rely on silence and time. Only systematic persistence disrupts that. As the years passed after sentencing, Estebalas Carranza remained confined under maximum security. The psychiatric institution where she was placed was designed for offenders considered highly dangerous, with surveillance and restrictions rivaling any prison. Reports on her behavior were rarely made public, but the sentence ensured she would never again walk freely in Vienna or anywhere else. In effect, the trial had not only judged past actions but secured the future against repetition. For Vienna, the case became one of its most notorious criminal events in modern memory. It reminded the public that even in safe, familiar spaces, hidden violence can exist. It challenged assumptions about what neighbors, spouses, or partners are capable of. And it reinforced a hard truth. Justice is sometimes delayed, but when evidence finally surfaces, it reshapes everything thought to be known. Closing this chapter does not erase the loss of Holger Holtz and Manfred Hinterberger. It does, however, stand as testimony that their lives were not forgotten and their disappearances not ignored. The trial, the sentence, and the community reckoning ensured their names remained part of Vienna's history, not as mysteries unresolved, but as victims whose stories were finally told in full. Looking back on this crime, I'm reminded that true danger doesn't always come from strangers. It can come from the people closest to us. Trust is powerful, but it should never blind us to warning signs. In America, we talk about community, accountability, and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. If this story leaves you with one thought, let it be this: silence allows harm to grow. What do you think? Should we be quicker to intervene when red flags appear, even in someone else's family? If this video touched you, leave a comment, share where you're watching from, and don't forget, subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next story.